Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. So it is in this spirit of accountability and empowerment that I welcome you to the Western Washington Fellowship of Reconciliation's annual fall retreat. So we have Martha Schmidt, Jonathan Rosenblum, Susie Beckerolu, and John Regan, and I'll just turn it over to them right now. What we'll do is they'll have a session from each of them of modest length. Then they'll have some conversation among themselves. Then we'll have questions from the audience, and we'll wrap this whole thing up at 11:30, so we can travel to our first workshop set. Thank you all so much.
I would like to start off by just a word of caution about the word justice as used with economic. And I think what I am interested in is actually achieving economic fairness, and sometimes using the word justice is so far removed, so remote, that it makes it hard for us to focus on the road to that. In my vision of economic justice for the 99%, I would say that we first have to consider building a society that's based on popular democracy, where people actually control the political process. Accompanying that is a focus and a movement towards economic democracy, a profound change in the society that we live in. I also think that having democratic society based on people's power and economic control is not complete without an alternative vision of inclusion, and I usually refer to that as the achievement of full human rights for every single person. I want to talk about what I think are the tasks that we should be focusing on, and maybe as a way to help shape our discussion today. One of those is what social movements can do and the ability of social movements to create a different kind of society. I think we have to ask all of ourselves, not just those that we disagree with, why we have accepted a narrow division of social movements and the divisions that neoliberalism has created. Obviously, one of our tasks as social movements is to challenge U.S. militarism and imperialism. And without that, we will never have any kind of economic justice. Of course, as a person who's engaged in teaching, I think education is incredibly important. I mean, we're here to educate ourselves today, but education is not only a lifelong process, it's a daily process. And I think it goes from the individual and includes all levels of society and reaches backward. So I see the education process as beginning with the individual, with the self, and our ability to become self-educated on how to create effective and positive change. And I'm going to mention some of the authors of books that I think are really helpful to new ways of thinking. So on that subject of changing ourselves, I would suggest people might consider looking at the works of Sharon Strand Ellison. who's written, among other books, Taking the War Out of Our Words. And what it is a focus on developing what she calls nonviolent methods of communication. Another part of the educational process, I think, includes studying history and the deliberate suppression of liberatory movements and directions that would have led to more comprehensive and connected social movements. And in particular in that area, I would recommend understanding and focusing on what happened to the Black Freedom Movement and the work of Carol Anderson, a book called Eyes Off the Prize, in which she documents how the attempts to build the Black Freedom Movement into a full human rights movement were deliberately sabotaged by private sector leaders and by government. She's a professor, I think, at the University of Missouri. Another part of the education process, I think, is to really understand how neoliberal ideology, not just the economic aspects, has actually shaped how we, hello Kat, has actually shaped how we pose what our alternatives are and how we see our potential for movement building. And I think this is evidenced by some of the issues that I would love to discuss with this panel that cropped up during the 15 Now campaign in Seattle. And a person who's really looked at how neoliberal ideology has affected our society and our ability to actually come up with alternatives that people can work for that will unify people, is the book by Philip Murawski called Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, and particularly his focus on the issue of climate change. Then I think another component of education is that we need to consider is learning from other cultures and internationally, and especially learning from indigenous movements, indigenous peoples movements, and the leadership styles and differences in those movements. And in that respect, I really recommend you the work of Raul Zabechi, the Uruguayan sociologist who wrote a book called Territories in Resistance that gives a lot of framework for understanding why there's been such positive and inspiring change in South America as a region. And then I think just one other comment, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan. At all times, I think our task is to also struggle for alternative institutions and alternative, what I call social relations, which is a huge subject, obviously.
Thanks, Marty. It's good to be here with FOR. So many familiar faces in the crowd. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
And Glenn started off noting there's a birthday in the room. It's also happy birthday, FOR, 100 years young, right, this year. And as long as we're celebrating important anniversaries, it was 15 years ago this month that World Trade leaders decided to come to our community. We had something to say about that, didn't we? So my name is Jonathan Rosenblum. I'm a union and community organizer. Until recently, I was the campaign director of the SeaTac Airport Workers Campaign, which led the $15 initiative that many of you have been involved in, I know, and probably everyone has heard about. But I'm going to talk more broadly in this keynote around the concept of economic justice, or if you want, economic fairness, To me, the answers that you get depend on the question you ask, and how you frame the question is very important. To me, there are three questions I want to address here. I think it's important to frame it in the following way. What is the problem that we're facing? What are we fighting for? And how do we get there? And on the first one, what is the problem? There's a lot of talk, especially in the mainstream media, about economic inequality, right? Income inequality, people are familiar with that term a lot. And I would submit that if that's all we're talking about, we're not getting to the real core of the problem. Let me just trace back a few years very briefly. Coming out of World War II, labor unions were relatively strong in this country. Working people had a strong voice. About 1 in every 3 workers belonged to a union in this country. And in spite of the problems and challenges that unions had, internally and externally back then, one has to admit that they were a lot stronger and played a more active role in public life in the United States. Going from what we call density, 1/3 density, 1/3 membership in the union, in the US workforce in the 1950s, we went to, does anybody know what the percentage of private sector workers in this country is today? We're in the union? Actually, it's less than 7%. It's 1 out of every 14 workers in the private sector belongs to a union. 13 out of 14 workers do not have union representation. How did this happen? Well, it happened because of McCarthyism that took some of the most vibrant elements of the labor movement and pushed to the side. It also happened because labor leaders made an accommodation beginning in the 1950s that said, we want to be part of the political life of this country, and so we're going to help you in kicking the communists and the radicals out of the labor movement and making peace with business and government. And that peace meant that labor got weaker. Unions stopped organizing. The economic distortions that we've seen in the last 35 years especially that have led to the kind of income inequality that we have today are not because captains of industry got smarter and figured out how to do it better, but because for the first time in the last couple of generations, as opposed to 60 years ago, they actually had the power to get away with it, and they didn't have the same amount of resistance. So for us, it's not simply about income inequality. That is a symptom of the problem. At its core, the problem is power inequality. And the challenge for us then is, how do we get power back? And how do we think about the labor movement, not just in terms of unions, but all of us who work for a living, or people who are allied with those who work for a living? We are as a whole the labor movement. So we have to look at it as power inequality, not simply income inequality. What are we fighting for? Now, in our day-to-day lives, we have a lot of things that we're fighting for. What are some of the things that you've been involved in, some of the campaigns you've been involved in recently? Just shout it out.
$15.
$15, okay, what else? Stopping foreclosures, yes, what else?
Climate change.
Climate change, against homelessness, anything else?
Stopping wars.
Stopping wars, yes, anybody work on behalf of Initiative 594?
Yeah.
Some sensible gun laws, at least the beginning of them.
Progressive taxes.
Regressive taxes. So I want to differentiate here issues and values. Issues are things that we fight for or against. We fight for an initiative, we fight for a candidate, we fight against wars, we fight against foreclosures, and there are some very important actions that take place when we do issues. Some of them are electoral, some of them are direct action. But those are issues. Issues tend to be negotiable, right? We get into the legislative arena, we get into the political arena, things are negotiable. Values are the core underlying beliefs that we hold that motivate us to take action. Values are not negotiable. It's who we are. It comes out of our politics, it comes out of our faith. Does that make sense? The differentiation between issues and values. And too often, as individuals, and I would say as collectives, we focus on issues to the exclusion of values because we get so wrapped up in the day-to-day and month-to-month work that we give short shrift to those core things that motivate us to be involved in the first place. Now, I described very briefly what happened with the labor movement in the last 60 years. But essentially what happened is labor leaders, union leaders, made a separate peace with government and business, focusing on issues that affected their members to the exclusion of the values that working people have as a class and lifting up those values. And so we got what we needed to get for our members until it started tilting the other way. But we weren't fighting for the values that working people need to fight for as a society as a whole. Now, I would say to you, the $15 fight, which I'm very proud to have been a part of, helping to launch at CTAC, was an important fight, but it was about issues, right? 15 is an issue. It's a wage that workers deserve to make. And by the way, it's not much of a living wage, but at least it's a start. But we have to, as a movement, get back to values. And I think for groups like FOR, it's instructive that you have a lot to add to this movement, to keep reminding activists as we go through our work day to day and month to month, that there are values that underlie the work that we do. We have to stay true to those values and not sacrifice them because of some possibility of short-term gain. So the third question, how do we get there? And I want to pause it again. There are two different approaches, and they're not exclusive. But again, it's a question of how balanced we are in our thoughts and our works, just like issues and values. How do we get there? There's bargaining and policy work, and then on the other side, there's organizing and collective action. Now, bargaining and policy work is anything that we do in the electoral or the political arena. You go to Olympia, you try to get a bill passed. What happens? You have to get it through committee, you have to get it through the chambers, you have to get it through the next committee, the next chamber, and so on. There's always going to be compromise in that. When you draft an initiative, you've got to work with other coalition partners, right? There are compromises inherent in that process. If you're sitting down with the mayor of Seattle to negotiate what the wages should be for workers in Seattle, there's going to be compromises in that process. Now, organizing is not about trying to achieve some settlement. Organizing is about trying to raise the temperature. It is trying to build your power so that you have something to negotiate for. And I would say too often we focus a lot on the bargaining and the policy work. How can we move the $15 wage to this community or to that community at the cost of organizing and collective action? Earlier this year, I was invited by a group up in Bellingham to speak about how do we win $15 in Bellingham. And that's what the question was when they started off. Is it, how do we bring $15 to Bellingham? And I said, that's the wrong question. The right question is, how do we build power in a fight so that 15 becomes the solution? But you don't start with the solution, you start with building your power. I've done a lot of collective bargaining work at bargaining tables with bosses, with our bargaining teams. And one of the things that we have to train union members on all the time, whenever they come to the bargaining table, is that what you get depends not on what you do at the table. It depends on what you do in the workplace and the community. 90%, we say, 90% of what you get depends on what you do outside of the bargaining table, and only 10% depends on the actual give and take at that table in that room. And one example is Seattle. And I would say the Seattle wage victory was a very important victory. It was a historic breakthrough. And yet there are some real problems with the actual details of what was negotiated. And the reason why it's so complicated is because after Shama Sawant's tremendous victory in November, right, and after the CTAC victory, the fight was taken largely inside. Now, that's not to say there wasn't outside agitation. Fast food workers engaged in a number of tremendous actions. There were tremendous acts of individual bravery by fast food workers to walk off the jobs. 15 Now led street heat actions that were tremendous in moving the negotiations forward. But most of the energy of the movement at that point was focused internally on what is the deal. And when you ask yourself what is the deal, then the other side understands very clearly. There's going to be compromises, and we're going to impose our compromises on the final settlement. And that's what happened. So it's just something for us to think about. We have to differentiate between bargaining and policy and collective action and organizing work. Organizing and collective action is what sets the table for a settlement, not the other way around. So, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Susan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susie Beccarolo, and I'm not standing up because I'm sick, so I hope that you in the back don't mind. I'd like to first thank Bortai, happy birthday, and Glenn, and all of the organizers of this fall retreat for having me here today. Second, I want to express how happy I am to be here among you all. We are all here today because we care about the 99%. We see grave injustices before us, and I've gathered to try to do something because we care about our fellow humans. Excuse me. I applaud you all for taking this Saturday to do just that. I am moved by others who care about the world we live in. That spark, that fire in the belly that drives people into action inspires me greatly. And I hope that you all walk away from this conference inspired too, and are even more motivated to go out and fight the good fight. When Socialist Alternative members are at rallies and protests, excuse me, we have our own chant. When we fight, we win. I hope you take our proclamation to heart. I think people are understanding more and more that we do have the power to change things. Each and every one of you has powerful potential. The more we unite and organize together towards our goals, the greater things we can achieve. I've never been more sure of this fact after seeing firsthand the successful movement building that has been taking place in Seattle. Being an activist there these past few years has been truly amazing and rewarding, and I've been so proud to be a part of all of it. It has very much confirmed to me how hungry people are for change. Ordinary working class people are finally standing up and fighting back. It has been incredible to see the victories that we've won after all of our hard work, and that is what I'm going to talk to you today about. First, we elected the first socialist in 100 years, Shama Sawant. The fact that we... I love it. The fact that we elected a socialist to the city council shows that people are increasingly open to the views of socialism. When Socialist Alternative ran Shama Sawant for city council, we had only 45 members in our Seattle chapter. Excuse me. 45 people is not that many people, but we were dedicated to building a movement, and our achievements were monumental. Over 100,000 voters elected an open socialist. Shama Sawant didn't take a dime in corporate cash and unseated a very well-connected 16-year incumbent. Shama has been using her seat on the council to be a voice for workers, youth, and the oppressed. The people of Seattle recognize that they have a real person, a real voice and power, and because of this, her office is inundated by hundreds of people who seek her help every single day. Seattle has the second highest paid city council in the country after Los Angeles, but Shama only accepts the average worker's wage, $40,000, and donates the rest of her six-figure salary to building social justice movements. Yeah! This really resonates with the people that their elected official is not out of touch. Shama is also the only member of the city council who refuses to take any corporate donations. Shama has had many successes after taking office. She was successful in changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Yeah! She was also able to get Seattle City Light to amend their policies so that thousands more households could take advantage of low-income discounts. With these victories, is it any wonder why she's the most popular city council member with an unheard of 60% approval rating? Perhaps the greatest victory she was a part of, however, occurred only 6 months after she took office, when the highest minimum wage in the country was won. This lifted the wages of 100,000 workers at the bottom of the wage scale. Forbes magazine put it best when they said, "There has been no doubt that Sawant is a different kind of politician, shifting the discussion quickly to her demand to increase the minimum wage to 15, and it wasn't just talk, she succeeded. Yes, we have such a deep enough impact that the right wing and conservative business publications like Forbes are talking about it." The 15 Now campaign was a victory not just for this region. It has inspired the entire nation, and the movement to raise the minimum wage has spread like wildfire. Ballot initiatives to raise the minimum wage in the last election a few days ago passed with decisive margins in all 4 states where it was up for a vote. All of these states are conservative states: Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota. Excuse me. San Francisco has now become the second major city after Seattle to implement a $15 minimum wage, which passed with 77% of the vote. The $15 an hour measure in San Francisco is actually even much stronger than Seattle's law. Just 10 days after we won 15, Socialist Alternative filed Jess Spear as a candidate for the State House against incumbent Frank Chop. Like the campaign for Sawant, the Vote Spear campaign refused to take any corporate donations. Her campaign also brought issues that were hardly talked about to the forefront. The campaign succeeded in forcing a debate in the mass media and the wider public on the need for rent control. The campaign has also shed light on the fact that the state legislature was held in contempt of court by the state Supreme Court for criminally underfunding education. And thus, in response, Chop tried to present himself as a champion of school funding. And under the pressure of the Spear campaign, Chop also claimed to be for rent control despite having nothing to advance over his 10-year tenure, including having years of a Democratic supermajority in both chambers of the legislature and a Democratic governor. Chop claimed to be an early advocate in the fight for 15, yet failed to get a $12 minimum wage out of committee. The campaign also played a decisive role in organizing the People's Climate March in Seattle on September 21st, drawing 2,000 people to the rally and hundreds to blockade oil and coal trains. The campaign also, The campaign also exposed how the city of Seattle had no plan in case an oil train had an accident, and forced them to make one in case it did happen. All of these campaigns have demonstrated that independent candidates and ordinary working class people can challenge the establishment, even without taking a dime of corporate money. The votes for these fiery socialist candidates also illustrate the anger at the corporate-controlled establishment. The working class anger at corporate politics simmering beneath the surface of society would have never been expressed in Seattle and channeled in a progressive direction in 2013 if we had not taken a bold electoral initiative. This is why it is vital that labor and other progressive movements not only organize rallies, strikes, etc., but also follow Sawant's example of running independent candidates. Otherwise, political discussions and debates throughout society are going to be controlled and limited by the 2 corporate parties who only care about their agenda. What is happening in Seattle are the beginnings of a movement that hasn't been seen in decades. It's energetic, it's passionate, it's causing all of the eyes of the nation to be on Seattle. And it's because we have the willpower to fight for it. And I hope that these lessons serve as examples to embolden you to go out there and to continually fight the good fight. I hope they serve as reminders that progress is achievable. It's important to note, however, that these victories are only reforms and do not fix the root cause of the problem. What we really need is systematic change. We face grave problems due to capitalism, but it doesn't have to be this way. There are achievable methods that can solve our systemic dilemmas, and I invite you to join my workshop on Socialist Alternative to learn more. Please join the struggle for a more equal and just society, because as we say, when we fight, we win. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's kind of interesting. I'm looking at our panel, and Martha gave us kind of an academic overview that stressed values. And Jonathan gave us a perspective about unions and union organizing for a $15 an hour wage. And with Susan, we heard the electoral process. So I think I'm going to talk about cooperatives. 4 years ago, I ran for the board of directors of the Olympia Food Co-op. At that time, the Olympia Food Co-op was facing two huge issues. And you probably are all aware of one. The Olympia Food Co-op decided to boycott Israeli products. Yes. Well, there was another issue, and that issue was that the Olympia Food Co-op was considering expanding. And expansion in the eyes of some people meant that we had to move from a consensus-based collective form of management. That we had to become more like a regular business with a general manager. Now that particular issue didn't get the kind of press that the boycott of Israeli food products got, but it was a very important issue that the Olympia Food Co-op addressed. Before I tell you how the Olympia Food Co-op addressed the issue of collectively based, consensus-based management, I want to say that for the last 4 years, 16 members of the Olympia Food Co-op, including myself, have been facing a lawsuit which has gone through 2 courts and is currently before the Supreme Court of the state of Washington. You probably don't read anything about it because nothing is published about it. I don't think anybody wants to write about what's going on. But it is a major, major lawsuit that is cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Getting back to the issue of management, we have this notion here in the United States that cooperatives are made up of 4 or 5 people who get together and decide that they're going to run a business. That cooperatives have no application to businesses that are large. The Olympia Food Co-op with 80 staff workers is probably the largest worker cooperative, certainly that I know of in the United States. But I had worked with a cooperative in Venezuela, a 45-year-old cooperative, that had 1,000 workers, and they used a consensus-based form of management, and they'd been highly successful. So when I was elected to the board of the Olympia Food Co-op, I proposed that we do an exchange with the workers of Seco Se Sola in Venezuela, that we send 2 workers to work in the Seco Se Sola Co-op and learn about them, and that the Seco Se Sola Co-op send workers and work in our co-op. Now, it's amazing to me, the Olympia Food Co-op, with this lawsuit going on and threats coming from every direction, said, yes, this sounds like a good idea. And so I went to Venezuela and I talked with the Seco Se Sola Co-op and made presentations in the various groups within the co-op. And the first response I got was, there are no cooperatives in the United States, period. So I gave them a copy of our newsletter and I gave them a copy of, we have some literature in Spanish. And they looked at me and they said, well, maybe. Anyway, they considered doing the exchange, and we sent 2 members in 2012 to Venezuela, and they sent 4 members here. And I think what we learned has been really, really beyond what we had originally thought we could learn. Originally, we wanted to learn about cooperatives. We wanted to learn whether the Olympia Food Co-op, which was 35 years old, its management, philosophy, style, culture could apply to other businesses in the Thurston County area, whether we should think about building more cooperatives. Well, in Barquisimeto, we learned, Barquisimeto, Venezuela, where Seco Se Sola, we learned a lot about cooperatives and cooperative culture. They told us the history of their cooperative, that it started very small. It was actually a funeral cooperative. One of their neighbors couldn't afford to pay for the funeral, so people got together and they paid for the funeral. It then grew into a food cooperative, a furniture purchasing cooperative, a farm cooperative, numerous cooperatives and networks of cooperatives. Most recently, they completed building a hospital. We looked, our staff who visited Seco Se Sola looked at this entire system. And there's a couple of things that became very, very clear. One is that these were low-income people. These were people who had been excluded from the economy, the oil economy of Venezuela, and there were people who had largely been excluded from the agricultural economy. Barquisimeto is a city with more than 1 million people. It's located on the banks of the fertile Quibor Valley. In the Quibor Valley, sugar is grown. The good land is used for sugar. In Barquisimeto, sugar is routinely in short supply because sugar is an internationally traded product that responds to the market internationally. On the other hand, the farms that belong to Seco Se Sola are in the hills of Sanare, exhausted, rugged soils, rocky soils, where they produce enough food to feed 40% of the population of Barquisimeto. We learned that whereas here in the United States, the cooperative food movement and food co-ops were largely a middle class to higher income phenomenon, their cooperatives were largely among people who had been excluded from the economy, where people got together and organized to provide for themselves and had been highly successful at doing it. So it was exciting to see what was taking place in Venezuela. And in June of 2012, 4 members of the co-op, workers in the cooperative, came here. And they looked at our Olympia Food Co-op and they're quite surprised that we operated with much the same culture. They were quite surprised because, you know, they see the same television as we do, and Americans are kind of portrayed in a much different light than maybe some of us really are. But they weren't here 3 days, and they said to us, they said, you know, you're a single cooperative. What we have in Venezuela is networks of cooperatives. They said, you know, we do have 1,000 workers in our cooperative, but we're part of a network of 20,000 workers. And we coordinate production and pricing and everything with each other at meetings. We've created an economy within an economy that we manage. And what they referred to it as is a solidarity economy. An economy in which the community provided for itself. Now here, there is this attitude that people who are interested in the local economy and community economy are really not interested in the bigger picture. You know, that we tend to be locally focused and not globally focused. if we talk to Seco Se Sola, their response would be, yes, we're focused locally, we're focused growing locally and linking with others who think the way we do. And Seco Se Sola has sent workers to such places as Egypt, Mexico, France, where they've been invited to spread the word and explain systems of creating cooperatives. And when they were here, their advice was build a movement. No matter how small, start building a movement. And in visiting Thurston County and visiting cooperatives in Portland, they looked at what we had here and they said, get together. And so we created a conference. They stuck with their message, and here in Olympia, we've started building an organization that links cooperatives together. And that organization is called CoSound. It's made up of people that have the Blue Moon Cafe in downtown Olympia, the Flaming Eggplant, which is student-run on the campus of Evergreen, Northwest Workers Cooperative, the Northwest Cooperative Development Center. And so what we're trying to do is create our own path for an economy that is based on the ground and grows up. And so I think that there's lots of different ways of looking at social change and creating a new economy. But I think the way that Seco Se Sola is doing it provides a way of looking at it that tells us, yes, it is doable, and two, that it can provide a better quality of life, both materially and culturally, for the people that participate in that economy. So that's what we're working on, and I think it's really exciting to be part of this. And currently we are planning another exchange with Seco Se Sola, in which we're sending workers in cooperatives here to work in Seco Se Sola, as well as have Seco Se Sola workers come here about this time next year.
Well, thank you to the panel members, and we designed the panel to represent the wisdom of our workshop presenters, but without being redundant to the workshop that these four people will present later on in the day. We have four equally talented workshop topics and presenters also on the schedule. We could not have an 8-member panel, that would have been unwieldy. But we appreciate these four that are here.
Okay, so one thing I would like to discuss is the issue of raising expectations and working from values, and particularly maybe focus around the 15 now situation, since we all are fresh from our experiences with that and learnings. And I would like to suggest that if in fact we define values as human rights, as having a legal basis in human rights, that we would have been in and brought that into all of our social movements, we would have been in quite a different position now with respect to working on raising the minimum wage. And in particular, I would suggest that if we don't situate our issues, the issues that we are struggling for in the political arena, if we don't situate those within higher aspirations for complete human rights, we're going to be getting a lot less than what we need, and we're going to face a lot of despair and falling away of our the people who are involved in our social movements. And just my example with 15 Now, it framed as an issue of raising the minimum wage. Human rights recognizes that every single person has a right to an adequate standard of living and to wages that are living wages that are adequate and conditions that including, full right to health care and health. And what we ended up with was a discussion, which of course was forced by the employers, of a discussion about forfeiting health care for having higher wages, a discussion about tips, discussions about things that actually impinge on workers' other rights and all people's rights. And this could be avoided with a different way of framing issues. So I'd love to hear what other people might have to say about that. But I'm very distressed at how the 4-year phase-in developed in Seattle.
I think it's a good idea, but I also think that there is a problem with bracketing everything in terms of human rights, because it's telling people what they're entitled to, but it's not saying where the power is. And right now we have a situation where if power is related to money, power is highly concentrated in this country. And extending rights is wonderful, and the consequences can be great, but it doesn't dislodge power. And as long as it doesn't dislodge power, there's simply going to be a different way of doing things. I like to look at it this way. There's the 99% and there's the 1%. The 99% is constantly changing in terms of how laws are applied, who pays taxes, how rights are evaluated. The 99% internally is pitted against each other, but the 1% is invulnerable. And I think that looking at things in terms simply of human rights, and I don't think that we're really talking simply human rights, is the best way. I think we have to talk power. And we have to think in terms of power. In Venezuela, the word is popular power. And the ministries in Venezuela are ministries of popular power and education, everything. It's about people taking power. And I think this is a real difference in terms of how we organize and view organizing.
I'd just like to address the 15 minimum wage being watered down by several forces. Union leadership was extremely disappointing. They simply failed to defend workers' rights. And the business leaders in the area and the politicians in power did everything they could to water down the 15. It's a large phase-in. They took out cost of living adjustment. They enacted the tips wages, as you mentioned, and we tried very hard to fight back, but simply it was a very hard struggle. But I also agree with you. I think that living wage should be a human right. I think we should fight for our rights, and I agree with the stance that there are several human rights that we need to address as human rights.
Thanks. I think that's great framing, Martha, on raising expectations that these fights, for example, the fight for 15, is not a bad thing because it's a very good thing because not just because of what we can win objectively, concretely, but the fight itself is successful to the extent it engages ordinary people in a fight through which they learn about how to build and project power. You could go out we will win wage increases for millions of workers around the country in the next few years, I'm convinced, because of the popular momentum around it. Some of these fights will build power, some of them will not. And I would suggest that the ones that matter are the ones that build power. The gift that Shaman and the socialist alternative movement in Seattle have given to the movement, to me, is not really so much about the $15 wage. It's about opening up the conversation of possibilities, that there is a different way to organize our society, and we should think about it and we should imagine it, and through our actions in the streets, we can take steps toward it. But 15 is not our end goal. 15 is merely a struggle on the way to there. So I think, you're absolutely right. We do have to think about it as human rights. And that's why, again, I think groups like FOR can play an important role in the broader labor movement in insisting that we have to bring this conversation back to values and back to power, not simply think about the immediate campaign that's in front of us.
I just want to say that I completely agree with Jonathan, and I want to stress the importance of building movements. And I want to remind you that in this country we have a great history of fighting for our rights and winning. We had slavery, we had child labor, we had sweatshops, we had 16-hour workdays. It wasn't until the decent middle-class living standards did not emerge until after World War II, and workers had to unionize, to fight and win decent living standards. And I think that we have a moral obligation to fight for our rights and for a better world.
And I think that as a former SEIU organizer too, like Jonathan, I think that we cannot undervalue the importance of freedom of association and the right to organize as core to building economic justice, because if people in the workplace don't have democracy, if they cannot change the power relationships, we're not only not going to achieve our economic rights, we're not going to have a society that's democratic, period. And I think that one of the goals of any movement working for economic justice has to be to engage with many, many people about why organizing is important, why unions are essential to a democratic society. And there's a lot of anti-union sentiment in this country, and it really needs to be taken apart and discussed, because we're not going to but just by saying that it's there or trying to work around it, we're not going to be able to deal with this. And the media has done an incredible job to convince so many people that unions, union leaders are all big bad bosses, and unions are corrupt, and unions will take your money, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's why I think, the whole notion of freedom of association, which is what underpins the right to organize into unions, is also key to having a democratic society and to all our other work. Like here, we're associating in a group. We rely on the expectation that we can do this, and we can be here, and we can criticize things and change things. And that has to be extended to all arenas, including unions.
Marty's urging of associating leads us into the wider conversation with Q&A among the people here. I appreciate the four panel members who raised different tangents, and they could find ways to play off each other, but I think there's actually a lot of common ground among them, and we look at different facets of it. I'd like to invite questions from anybody else who's here to ask any one or more of the panel members.
Seems like, couple of ways of talking about this. John Reagan's talking about cooperatives, and Susan's talking about organizing a political party. What can you talk about the different approach? Why would you want a party, and why would you want to work without parties?
I think it gets down to how do you create change? And because of our history, our legacy of political democracy, we think of change as something that can be done politically. And some changes can be done politically, but some changes can't. And I've spent a lot of time in El Salvador where people felt that if they elected the FMLN, the guerrilla party of El Salvador, that there would be huge changes. Well, the FMLN got elected, and those changes didn't come. In Venezuela, we saw the election of Hugo Chavez, whose strategy wasn't originally to become elected head of the country, but he changed strategy while he was in prison. He became head of the country, and what he realized is that he had this huge bureaucracy. He had a culture in the country that made it very, very difficult to create change. And he went through many, many different stages of trying to figure out a way of creating change. And that evolution, I think, leads to a conclusion that we should be coming to after electing President Obama, that change is going to come from the people, it's going to come from the base. It's not going to come from the top. And yes, we can do things, we can elect a socialist, and that's wonderful. I mean, you know, when I was in the 8th grade, I was reading the Socialist Labor Party literature. You know, we're going to elect Eric Haas, President of the United States. Well, that's great, but, you know, how do you really create change? Is the culture of the country going to change? I don't think so. I think it's good, but I don't think it's going to create the kind of fundamental change we need.
Hey everybody, my name is Dylan. I'm a student at TCC and a founding member of the Nonviolent Methods of Power Transition Club. So, one thing I wanted to bring up is how my generation sees this. We've been told since we were toddlers that the oceans are rising. They're coming. We have absolutely no faith in my generation in the political system in this country. We don't vote. Very few of us vote. Boo indeed. But they don't understand the system. It's very confusing. What happens when we're told 8 years ago, wonderful change, isn't this great? 10 years away from it, here we are, becoming more and more and more conservative in the worst way. What we're afraid of in my generation is not the seas rising. It's not an ineffective political system that we know isn't going to work in our benefit. It's the fact that there's a huge mountain of high-quality misinformation that's present throughout the media sphere. And that works heavily against my future interest in a big way. So my question, I don't know if this is good for the last question in the forum, but what's a good way for me to reach out and grab people in my generation and go, hey, look, wake up, kind of a deal. Trying to find a better way to word this. In our club, the biggest wall I hit when I'm talking about these issues is, like I say, misinformation. The way that the world is seen is the way that it's presented on TV. That, you know, the United States can do no wrong.
Exceptionalism.
Right. Dissent is becoming taboo. It's becoming disencouraged. Yeah. So that's my question. Is you know, what's a good way to get guys my age and younger more than just saying, hey, you need to pay attention?